Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here to this seminar, and thank you for all speaking English so that I can also follow your very interesting presentations. In fact, I had heard of the SmartSea project for a long time already, and it's really a pleasure to sort of, increase my knowledge as well and to get to know what you're doing here. Before I sort of will talk about multi-use in European seas, let me introduce myself. So my name is Angela Schultz-Zehden. I'm coming from the beautiful maritime city of Berlin, and I'm indeed founder and managing director of SPRO Sustainable Projects, and at the same time the managing director and founder of a non-for-profit network, the SUBMARINER Network for Blue Growth, which was evolving out of a project, and where in fact then, I will show you later on, all the members have said, okay, we should really sort of institutionalize this good cooperation. For me, this day will be a success if we sort of, it's an open network, it's always looking for new members, and I've seen so many good things you're doing here in Finland, and I think it would be very nice if you could sort of join this group in order to share this experience and knowledge across the Baltic as well as the European seas. So first, in terms of SPRO Sustainable Projects, some of you here in this room actually also know me, since I've been involved in maritime spatial planning since 2001, actually starting with a project called Baltcoast, where Finland was also already thinking about how to do maritime spatial planning. Most relevant is also for SmartSea that since 2016 we have the pleasure to actually accompany the European Commission in running the service, the assistance mechanism for to implement maritime spatial planning throughout Europe, and we are running the so-called EU MSP platform, which is a whole repository of all good practices and tools, and is really there in order to sort of exchange knowledge and experience on this still evolving a new tool of maritime spatial planning. And I would hope that SmartSea is actually also that we get a lot of practices and tools on what you are doing here also to transfer across. This is actually also, as we have seen already this morning, maritime spatial planning is not only something which is really now pushing in Europe, with all of you having to do maritime spatial plans by 2021, but it's also really coming globally. So we are also working for the United Nations and have just recently launched the MSP toolkit there, and are also running the MSP process in South Africa, Namibia and Angola. Apart from that, we are also running blue growth studies, especially for the European Commission. So we have been in charge of the Baltic Blue Growth Agenda, and actually also developing the implementation strategy for the Baltic Blue Growth Agenda, and are assisting actually in the push now from the European Commission in going into blue investments. That's sort of the new sort of kid on the block, that we are really talking about big investment funds, and I think that many of you have followed that there is a big blue investment fund now coming through, and this may also be available for multi-users, as we will talk about, but actually also much smaller scale projects on circular economy. So having said all this, let's move now to the SUBMARINER Network, and you will see me now here. And in fact, yeah, let's just after lunch, just let me hear. Have you ever thought about using marine resources in a new way? We at the SUBMARINER Network have been promoting their potential since 2011. As well as current uses such as human food and cosmetics, we see big opportunities in many other areas, for example feed, medicine and improving water quality. Our network aims to harness this potential and make completely new, innovative product and service ideas a reality in the Baltic Sea region.
SUBMARINER Network is an independent and self-funded organisation, which means we can set our own agenda. For this, we have identified 8 thematic topics to focus on. These topics need to be tackled from different angles to get from individual resources to a circular economy. For example, scientific research is very important. However, we also need other actions driven by policy, business and citizens to really make progress. That is why the SUBMARINER Network uses a multi-layer approach. It unites members from science, administration and business. They come from all across the Baltic Sea and work at local, national and regional levels. And, crucially, our members all contribute their individual expertise to help each other. Through our network approach, our members connect with partners and work together in projects. The SUBMARINER Network acts as an umbrella organisation and initiates the project development. This way, projects in different topical areas can make the most of synergies and communicate with each other. This approach, in turn, generates new ideas that can be taken forward.
The SUBMARINER Network will continue to focus on its vision for the Baltic Sea region's blue-green economy. We aim to improve its natural capital and enhance sustainable production and human well-being. Realizing this vision requires more and new actors and actions. Join us and help us make this vision a reality. To learn more about the SUBMARINER Network, its publications and membership options, visit our website. Okay, so I think that, my team sort of, told me I should have a film because then it's sort of faster how to sort of always explain the SUBMARINER Network. But of course, you have also the opportunity to talk to me over coffee break, and I sort of will also stay for the evening. So just that you know more about what we are doing. You see here our current membership. You see also that we have Finnish partners. I'm very happy to have the colleagues here also from Syke and from some of the regions. And the idea is really that, I have seen here this morning many good examples of how you're sort of cooperating throughout Finland, but when we come to topics like blue biotechnology promotion, it's basically that you really have to pool the resources across the Baltic Sea region, as also in maritime spatial planning. So it's really sort of the hub in the Baltic Sea region. And it's in fact also sort of, connecting then throughout Europe with the advantage that it's only one organization representing the Baltic Sea region. And you know yourself then when we are talking about aquaculture or offshore wind, it may not always be the Baltic Sea region, which is really sort of, the hub throughout Europe, even though that many very good ideas are coming from this region. What are the other sorts of projects we are dealing with? It's the Baltic Blue Biotechnology Alliance, which is really the hub in terms of reaching from research to final product development in blue biotechnology, where we have a whole mentor system and sort of align the different scientific resources across the Baltic Sea. In our Aquatech, we have heard today about recirculating aquaculture systems, so that's an initiative which is also, fostering technology and knowledge transfer. Baltic Blue Growth is the project which is on promoting large-scale mussel cultivation in the Baltic Sea, so not really for human food because they are too small, but in fact, also having an ecosystem service function, picking up nutrients, but at the same time also acting as a protein source, potentially to go into the feed industry for fish aquaculture then again. Smart Blue Regions is the project which is really on, promoting and fostering knowledge across the regions on how to do smart specialization for blue growth. And then we have also a project Baltic Rim, very much driven also by Finland, which is actually about how to have integrated maritime cultural heritage management and to integrate this also into maritime spatial planning. And last but not least, the project I will talk about today is about multi-use of European seas. As you saw in our sort of ambitions of the SUBMARINER Network, the 8th topic already in 2011 was, the idea of how can we promote combinations with offshore wind parks, but in fact also not only offshore wind parks, but in fact how can we sort of create synergies across maritime uses, as well as then actually even fostering the blue-green economy, so actually how to create synergies among blue and land economies. Next project will be sort of the blue platform, bioeconomy for blue growth, where we actually will have a kind of roadshow and hopefully come back to Finland on that. And in fact, there are more projects to come. So in fact, we are currently working we are awaiting the results on GRASS, which is about macroalgae cultivation, operational pilots on monitoring technologies, and Baltic Pro Blue is about promoting blue bio-based products. So because one actually also has to bring them to the market, cooperating with retailers, and Blue Forest is about innovative financing mechanisms to foster blue growth. But now I want to talk about Muses. So what is Muses? What was Muses? In fact, Muses is coming to its end. It's a 2-year-long project. It started in November 2016. It's a Horizon project. It's, as you can see from yourself, it's with 10 partners across Europe. It's led by Marine Scotland. We got the approval on the day of the Brexit. And in fact, what is quite interesting is that this project, in contrast to previous projects which were dealing with multi-use, is really having partners across the whole of Europe. So actually also really from the Mediterranean, from the Black Sea, which is sort of, and I will show this in a second, which may sort of bring a little bit of a different perspective on what is multi-use, because previous projects had, of course, extremely focused on technology-driven solutions in terms of platforms and using joint installations. So what is multi-use? Actually, when we started with the project, it was quite clear that you have 10 people in the room or 20, and you will have 20 different definitions of what is multi-use. So in fact, we actually started off with defining for ourselves of what is multi-use. And you can see here sort of the very simple explanation we came up with is that multi-use in the realm of marine resource utilization is understood as the intentional joint resource use by 2 or more users. The users maybe very often are understood actually also of being different entities, so being 2 different companies, but in fact they could also be, and very often are, when we talk about more soft uses, can also be 1 company, as long as it's really talking about 2 different kind of maritime uses. So it's really in terms very similar to maritime spatial planning. It's sort of really a radical change from the concept of exclusive resource rights to inclusive sharing of resources by 2 or more users. These resources do not necessarily only have to be space. Of course, this is also about use of joint installation, but also use of joint staff resources. It's about joint marketing. So it's not only about the idea of using the same installation. So what's the difference between what is happening anyway? Because in the sea we do have multi-use, we always had it. But, the difference in terms of coexistence is that here you basically, you're sort of coexisting next to each other. Hopefully this is sort of, in a nice way, and nobody is sort of disturbing the other one. But very often, nowadays, with space getting a more scarce resource, it may also end up with conflicts, especially when you have sort of a new use coming into a traditional use, and where therefore you have the situation as we had with offshore wind parks, that sort of, you have the displacement of fishery, or you in fact have a problem of aquaculture as sort of a weaker user to come into this use again. Multi-use is sort of then the positive side. So it's really sort of making use of a win-win situation that you potentially sort of create synergies. So you have an active, proactive approach to sort of having this joint use. So that's really the difference. We have seen already many pictures today. This is sort of the Muses multi-use picture, which should sort of give you a bit of an idea of, the very many combinations you may sort of end up with. In Muses, we have, in the end, sort of focused on 9 different combinations, but in fact there are many, many more, and we have, for instance, not considered oil and gas, etc. So you see here many piles which are sort of, offshore wind related. I have already talked about it. The classical one is about the idea of offshore wind with aquaculture, but here we have to, of course, make the distinction between what kind of aquaculture. It's not necessarily fish. It may also be seaweed or mussels. But you have also sort of multi-uses related to sort of is fishery allowed into offshore wind parks or in the vicinity of offshore wind parks, yes or no, which may be really sort of mainly as a function of reducing conflicts with fishery. Offshore wind parks with tourism, that may be a simple solution, and but it may have a very important effect in terms of getting regional acceptance. But then you have also really different types of multi-uses related to aquaculture with wave combination, but also something like underwater cultural heritage combined with tourism and environmental protection. And in fact, this is not something which is of relevance here for Finland and the Baltic Sea, but of course you have also repurposing. So the idea of what do you do with oil and gas platforms to be decommissioned, and how can they be sort of repurposed? And all this is happening on the sea, but why is this picture showing also the land? Is that, blue economy is actually happening. Human beings happen to live on land normally. So in fact, the results are sort of, to be felt on land. And that's where also the decision makers are placed, and where in fact most of the actions really have to happen in terms of making this multi-use actually possible. Multi-use typology, again, there is a simple definition. Very often there is sort of misunderstanding that multi-use is something where you have a primary, that you are talking about installing an aquaculture into an existing offshore wind park. This may happen, a staggered development, so that you have a primary user who actually already has the rights to this primary zone, and there is a secondary user coming in. But this is sort of much, much more difficult. It's of course in the short term, you may think that it gets sort of faster results, and it may be something which is especially happening in sort of more softer combinations, and when in fact the user is really the same entity. Then in fact we have these situations. But actually, and this is also in terms of the visions that we are saying, okay, in 2050 we have to feed the world. It's that we are talking about joint multi-use development. And that's why I think it's also relevant here, where there may not be so many offshore wind parks yet around, but where in fact the advantages you can really get from when you have a joint planning right from the start, an intentional planning, because then you can sort of design it in such a way that this is possible. So in fact, you see the different typologies that, where is sort of this multi-use happening. You have the one where, in fact, the softer ones, the type 4, which is sort of, the lowest connection between the users, and where it's really just sort of, the two different users take place in the same ocean space, but not even at the same time. And this is sort of what I was talking about in terms of repurposing oil and gas platforms. But then we are moving up and of course then moving up to the ladder, which is type 1, and which is sort of the most known, which is really about joint platforms. So what was the aim of the Muses project? You see here sort of our predecessors, and in fact some of them are still ongoing, like the SOMOS and the Space4Sea project. SOMOS is, by the way, a privately funded project by Lloyd's Registers, and this really taking place in the Netherlands, where it is about offshore wind with seaweed aquaculture. The other ones were really about sort of technology development, technology ideas, but not so much focused on in which kind of environment are they actually taking place, and here we are talking about the legal, regulatory and policy environment. So the aim of Muses was really to sort of contribute to the harmonization of policy, legal and administration, and the improvement to overcome barriers on that level in order to enable multi-use to happen. So for this to happen, we first had to investigate what are really the economic benefits or the socio-economic benefits, what are sort of the barriers, and here also the ambition was to distinguish between real and perceived barriers. This is of course something which over time may change, but perceived meaning that this is something where it's really more about two different stakeholders having completely different perceptions among each other. So an offshore, always the classical example that, you know, an offshore wind developer may definitely not have the same interest as an aquaculture developer, is a completely different stakeholder, and they may sort of have also, they may not even have met yet, and that they have different perceptions on what is possible and what is not possible. Real, however, being of course technology, but actually also legal barriers. But of course those can also change. I mean, legal legislation is not something which is set in stone. So, and then as a result to propose solutions and actions to be taken. And I can already invite you now to the final conference, which is taking place in 1 month's time on the 10th of October in Brussels, where we will present the action plan. So you have exclusive rights now to this one. So here I can already, you know, show again. So we had what was, how was the approach? So first we had an analytical framework, and then we had sort of really across all sea basins in all 23 countries affected, an analysis of what kind of combinations may actually be possible, where is potential, and how is the situation at policy level. Is it promoting multi-use, yes or no? And then going into different case studies. These were the specific ones under the Muses project, where the idea was really to talk to stakeholders in terms of actually identifying, is it perceived, is it real, what are the perceptions, and also to dig deeper into what is sort of possible at sort of place-based. And of course then, however, also taking into account cases from previous projects and actually also other existing cases. And out of all this, we were developing the action plan and to present practical solutions on how to overcome these barriers, both at local as well as European level. So here I, so this is always happening. So in fact, even though I said we have later on focused on 9 combinations, in fact we came up with 14 different ones, many stakeholder interviews, and then in fact the case studies, which were then going even deeper. How was this done in terms of, there is, if you sort of happen to sort of then come across any publications from Muses, you will very often come across the term Derby. Yeah, I mean, it's a nice term. In fact, it's very similar to SWOT analysis. So in fact, to sort of see what is actually the positive driver for the given multi-use, as well as then also the real added value which is generated by this multi-use. But at the same time, what are the barriers associated to this multi-use, and what may also be the negative impacts, because we should not underestimate that, multi-use should happen everywhere and that this is always beautiful. I mean, you also don't want to share a house or an apartment all the time, but in fact, there may be very good arguments to have single sector approaches. So we should always sort of keep it in perspective that multi-use is something which may take place, but it does not necessarily have to take place. And here we should really sort of consider this. So what are sort of the classical drivers in general for multi-use? The very first one, and that's how it came about from maritime spatial planning, in terms of saying, okay, we really should use the sea efficiently. So if you have a development already in sea, then why not sort of use this given space also for another place? So like an industrial area, in order to keep as much space free of any use, any planned use, as possible for future generations. So that was sort of the main argument. But of course, it's also something which may sort of be relevant for countries and which have a lot of maritime space available, but where in fact very often we realize that this given maritime space, we are talking about very specific space. So we talk about coastal space, but it may also be really opening up development areas, for instance for aquaculture, where it's about really moving offshore and therefore using the opportunity of sort of, using installations which are already there or planning them jointly, where offshore is difficult and therefore, we can use sort of resources together. It's also a possibility of diversifying sectors. It enables certain uses to happen at all, because there's always very often a dominant use. In the south, it may be more tourism. In the north, it may be more the driver of renewable energy use, and how to get the second user to come in nevertheless. Okay. The barriers, however, there are different priorities of these sectors. There is really, all the permitting regimes are actually sort of laid out for single sectors, and it's really difficult to get this across. So the concept of multi-use has not entered legislation yet, and actually also not policy, even though it's so much promoted by the European Commission. But when we talk about it, okay. And then, of course, the question about real win-win. Very often it may not be such a super idea on a microeconomic level, but that in fact for the socio-economic reasons, for the regional, from the macroeconomic point of view, it is of benefit. Okay, so so why an action plan? Only one hint. It comes at the right time at the moment, because countries are busy with maritime spatial planning, so they are thinking increasingly of synergies and coordinating maritime sectors. There is the Blue Investment Initiative, and we have heard of SDGs 14 already. And why an action plan? Because, as I already said, multi-use is not something which is coming naturally. And there are not only two players. In fact, there are at least 3, if not more, players who have a decision on this. So it's in fact only happening if, the 3 players, so the 2 sectors plus the regulatory body, that at least out of the 3, that 2 are really saying, yes, we go for it. So it may not be necessarily the 2 sectors, but if the regulatory body and 1 sector are saying, yes, we want to push this 1 sector in, then it may happen. But it doesn't sort of come naturally. Okay, this I skip. So in terms of the action plan itself, it really shows the priority steps and the objectives. And now let's move to the opportunities in the Baltic Sea. Offshore wind, yes. But also underwater cultural heritage and tourism, and also pesca tourism. It may sound small scale, and you sort of say, well, these are really different kind of multi-uses, but these are sort of the opportunities which have been identified already with good cases in the Baltic Sea. So combinations with offshore wind sector, I have already talked about it. It's reducing conflicts in the planning stage. It's actually also giving new room, opens up space, and in fact it's also something where if we have mussel cultivation or seaweed cultivation, it may also do something good for the Baltic Sea. In terms of tourism, it's any kind of multi-use, be it related to pesca tourism, can sort of, or underwater cultural heritage, may prolong the tourism season. It may also, for fishery, sort of diversify, bring them new income. It may also open the understanding of what is sustainable fishery, and the same goes for underwater cultural heritage. Okay, now yes. Then so just this as a highlight, multi-use in policy, no. There are no economic incentives yet for multi-use in the Baltic Sea, but it is sort of mentioned quite often in maritime spatial planning. Okay, and this I can sort of tell you more about over coffee breaks in tourism, and in terms of offshore wind parks, I think I have already shown about what are the benefits, especially in terms of green credentials and cost savings. And let's move here. Overcoming barriers. So the big issue is about primary and secondary user issue. So in fact, to give a joint licensing to open sort of multi-use zones. In fact, financial viability, and therefore on that basis to really have specific pilots and studies in the real environment. And last but not least, the main issue here is to create the regulatory framework which is sort of promoting and giving incentives to have this macroeconomic solution. And this is not the case yet. So having said all this, these are all the cross-cutting issues which are necessary in terms of the multi-use boldfish and the actors you have already seen. And on that level, I would say thank you and join us on the 10th of October. Thank you.